thank you so much for inviting Georgia Justice Project to be a part of your class this morning. And thank you for the decades-long partnership that we have had with Trinity and the support that you've given us in so many ways. So I think many of you are already familiar with Georgia Justice Project. I liked how Leslie talked about the beloved community, because when I try to, when I've only got a few minutes to, or maybe less than a minute to explain our work to folks, I talk about how all of our work, we are a legal services organization, and all of our work is informed by the idea of the beloved community, and that the criminal legal system has really been used to divide us and to break down that community, particularly based on race and based on poverty. You want to see if you could? So I was asked to come speak this morning about criminal records, and in preparation for the upcoming event that we have in September 23rd. Sorry, I should know that. So what I'm going to do is give you a little bit of a background on the issues, and then talk about process and eligibility. Try to be as brief as possible. I'm a data person, and I always like to put in a bunch of data. So I might go kind of quick, and I know we've got a few minutes. Thank you so much at the end for some questions. All right, so I wanted to start with a little bit about language. And this is probably something, since you've been engaging in these conversations for a while, that you have talked about. But we think it's really important to not use words like felon or ex-felon or ex-offender. Those are sort of labels that a person can never move beyond in their lifetime. If you've got a felony in your background, you're always going to have a felony in your background. And like a lot of other movements, we try to use people-centered language. And we really kind of evolved ourselves on this about 10 years ago. It was a movement led by formerly incarcerated people, particularly Eddie Ellis out of the Center for New Leadership for Urban Solutions, who was formerly incarcerated, and kind of released a letter to a bunch of other advocates and said, look, please start thinking about your language, start referring to us using people-centered language, because first and foremost, whatever has gone on in our past, we are people, and that's how we want to be known. So just a few broad statistics about the criminal legal system. So I want to encourage everybody to, when you think about the criminal legal system, to think more broadly than just incarceration. Certainly, that is an important piece of what's going on. Right now, there are about 1.9 million people who are incarcerated in the U.S., which is, I think everyone probably knows, is the highest rate in the country. But really, I want you to think about this issue as mass supervision, because there are 5.5 million people in the country who are under some sort of criminal legal supervision. So there's about 2.9 million that are on probation in the United States, and 770,000 who are on parole. So even, most people who are even convicted of a felony never go to prison, they get put on probation. But probation comes with a lot of restrictions on how you can live your life, a lot of opportunities to sort of get tripped up and then maybe be sent to prison. So people tend to focus on what is sort of most visible is the number of people that are in cages in the country, but there's a lot of people that aren't necessarily in prison or jail who are also under some kind of supervision of the legal system. So these are just some statistics from Georgia. Right now, some of these have changed a little bit since we made this slide in the last year. Unfortunately, the number in local jails has gone up a little bit. Right now, there's about 95,000 people in Georgia who are incarcerated either in local jails or in prison. And the number on probation or parole has actually gone down a little bit. And Georgia Justice Project can take a little bit of credit for that. We drafted a law to reform the probation system in Georgia a little bit. And we've been able over the last couple of years to realize a 9% reduction in the number of people on felony probation. But we still have in Georgia the highest rate of probation in the country. So this is what we call our scary slide. Georgia has, this slide represents people under correctional control. in the United States. So the US, you'll see highlighted there kind of about in the middle, and then every state is shown sort of the rate of correctional control by state. That top line, that is Georgia. So we are way off the charts when it comes to the number of people that we keep under correctional control. And largely the reason that we are so bad is because we put so many people on probation in Georgia. So many states have limitations on like the amount of years that you can spend on probation, somewhere between 2 and 5 years. In Georgia, the average probation sentence can be over 10 years long. So our rate of probation tends to be about 3 times greater than other states on average. And this is just another way of looking at some of the statistics. So on the left-hand side, you'll see that we rank 4th on the highest rate of incarceration. So there are some other states that have higher rates of incarceration, but if you look all the way on the right, we have the highest rate of correctional control and in the middle, the highest rate of probation of any state. So there is a tremendous amount of work still to be done in spite of the modest improvements that we've made around probation in the last couple of years. And as other folks talked about this morning, there are massive racial disparities at every stage of the criminal legal system in the US and in Georgia. This is just one example because probation is a big issue that we focus on. We did some research when we were advocating for this new law that went into effect 2 years ago on rates of probation by race in different counties. And in most counties, there are great disparities. Black people are much more likely to be put on probation. In some counties, like Fulton County, 8 times more likely to be on probation or to get probation if you are Black. So the disparities are very great. So just to come back a little bit to Georgia. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, no, you're fine. We can, is it okay if we take questions during? Sure. No, go ahead. Go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
Is that a legislative issue as it relates to, like, the state of Georgia and law or probation, or is that a county by county issue? How is that regulated?
In terms of people on probation or?
Like the state, if we have the highest rate, is that written in code, like in Georgia's legislative code? Is that one of the reasons we have a higher rate of probation versus other states?
Yeah, so I think there are several reasons. At the highest level, I think, what you've probably learned about when you had Brian come speak to you is that the criminal legal system is a legacy of slavery, and when slavery ended and it went into the Black codes, they sort of evolved into the criminal legal system. So I think a large part, it has to do with this legacy of racism that we have in our state. But also there are some particular laws in Georgia that make it more likely that people are going to be, I'm sure you've heard of like third strikes law. Georgia actually has some second strikes law. So if a person is convicted of an additional felony, they're much more likely to go to prison in Georgia. We are just much more likely to put people on probation than other states. So in a lot of states, they have more diversionary programs. You could also talk about a lack of access to services. Many of the people that we work with at Georgia Justice Project, particularly in our defense work, because in the slide I was going to talk about the different ways that we show up. And at our core, what we've been doing for 37 years is we represent people who have pending criminal cases in Fulton and DeKalb County. And we do what makes us, we represent the same people that would be represented by the public defender, people that can't afford an attorney. What makes us different is we're fortunate to have low caseloads and all of our clients are paired with a social worker for social services. But the vast majority of our clients have serious mental health issues or serious addiction issues that are untreated and have been untreated for many, many years. So another way that we get into this position in Georgia is that we just simply don't have the services for people to be able to access. And the technical problems have popped up again. So if you want to come put if somebody can put the password back in. So just a little bit more about Georgia Justice Project. Like I said, our core service is this criminal defense, but we work at every single stage of the criminal legal system. So we represent, thank you so much. Should I have just pressed cancel? Okay. We also, if our clients are incarcerated, we visit them while they are in prison. We take their family to visit them while we are in prison. We have some new programs. We have a new warrant resolution clinic, where we're partnering with some folks in Fulton County and the city of Atlanta. We work out at the Metro Reentry Facility. We've been doing that since they opened. And then about 15 years ago, we started what became the largest part of our work, which is our criminal records work. So definitely going to talk more about that in a few minutes. And then, of course, our policy work. We didn't used to do policy work, but when we started doing criminal records work, which wasn't really something anybody else in the state was doing, we realized that the laws were really bad and we couldn't help very many people to clean up their records. So we jumped into the policy world, which can be a difficult, challenging, and unpredictable world. And since 2010, when we really jumped in, we've been able to pass 22 laws that have reduced barriers to reentry or reduced the number of people under correctional control in Georgia. So we take what we learn from working with people through our direct representation, and we try to translate that into legislative solutions that would address some of these issues about like the long probation sentences. So like I said, all of our work is geared towards two goals: reducing the number of people under correctional control and reducing those barriers to reentry. So to focus on criminal records a little bit more closely, just to talk a little bit about the scope of the issue and why events like what Trinity is hosting are important. Anyone who has ever been arrested, fingerprinted in the country has a criminal record. So it doesn't mean, you only have a criminal record if you went to prison or you were convicted of a felony. So that turns out nationwide to be the closest number that we have is about 77 million people have some sort of criminal history. In Georgia, 4.5, the Georgia Crime Information Center, which is our state agency that keeps track of criminal records, they've got records on 4.5 million individuals. So some of them, may have moved or may have passed away. We've been keeping these records since the mid 60s. But any way you slice it, 4.5 million people is a tremendous amount of people. And the estimate is somewhere between 25% and 30% of adults in Georgia have some sort of criminal record. Nationwide, 50% of children have at least one parent that has some kind of criminal record, even if it was an arrest that didn't result in a conviction. And even those can result in barriers for folks, barriers to opportunity. So, we do tend to, when we think about the criminal legal system, we tend to go to the people that have felony convictions, which is a smaller percentage than you might think of the people that have a record. So 19 million people in the country have a felony conviction, about 645,000 in Georgia. And only about 8.5% of those have been convicted of a serious violent felony or a serious sex offense. So one of the things that Georgia does is we define a lot of conduct as a felony that a lot of states don't define as a felony. It might be a misdemeanor. So like in Georgia, the only drug offense that's a misdemeanor is possession of less than an ounce of marijuana. Every other thing, no matter what the drug is, no matter how much a person may be found to have, is going to be a felony. That is not the case in a lot of states. If you were found with like a small amount of cocaine or something like that, it might be a misdemeanor, but it's always a felony here. So that's one of the big reasons why we got here. And of course, we talked about just sort of the racial disparities in the system at large shows up in criminal records too, not only in who gets a criminal record, because if you're Black in particular, you're much more likely to be targeted by the police. Once you are targeted, you're much more likely to be arrested rather than given a warning. Once you are in the system and you have a case, you're much more likely to be convicted and much more likely to receive a harsher sentence. So you're much more likely to get a criminal record. But then there are also great disparities in how those records are used. So, and there's this sort of combination between just general discrimination in something like hiring, racial discrimination in hiring, and discrimination against people with a criminal record. So I think the number is, if a Black person and a white person go in to apply for a job, not talking about a criminal record at all, the white person is about 35% more likely to get a call back for that job. Then you add in the impact of a criminal record and the you're about half as likely to get a call back for a job if you have a record as if you're Black than a white person that has a record. So sort of combine those things, and it can be a real barrier to opportunity for folks. So did want to talk just a little bit about some of the, why this work is important and why it's important that the community be involved. Some of you may have heard the term collateral consequences. So those are those sort of official discrimination against people that have a criminal history. We have 48,000 laws and regulations in the country that impose some kind of barrier to folks if they have a record. It could be a barrier to holding a certain profession. It could be a barrier to, I'm trying to think, it impacts every area of your life. It could be a barrier to living someplace, just so many barriers. Georgia has about a little bit over 1,000 laws and regulations that impose these barriers. Like I said, 48,000, 72% of them have to do with employment and imposing barriers to employment for folks. In spite of the fact that all of the evidence says the best antidote to recidivism, to a person, sort of staying out of trouble, is for them to have steady employment. But we've made it really hard for folks to get a job when they have a record. So that's our official discrimination. That doesn't even get to sort of unofficial discrimination that, if I'm a landlord, but I say I'm not going to rent my apartment to somebody that has a criminal record, or I'm trying to, I'm trying to get a job. There's no particular law that says I can't have that job, but the employer says I'm not going to hire you because you have a criminal record. So there's different layers of barriers that folks have to deal with. And of course, this has a tremendous impact on how a person views themselves and their confidence level going into looking for a job, knowing that, their record is going to show up, having been through this experience where, they get offered a job based on their qualifications and how they show up in an interview, and, sometimes even start that job. That often happens for our clients. And then a couple days in, when the background check is complete, they're pulled off of the job. They're told, we can't give you this opportunity because of this thing that may have happened 10, 15 years ago and has nothing to do with who you are today. So, one of the big concerns when people think about this issue, or even hosting an event, think about safety. Well, do we want to invite people that have criminal records into our space? And, are these laws in effect to make our community safer? But the reality is almost none of these laws that exist to impose barriers to folks are based in sound public policy research. There's no research that says that people who have a criminal record can't perform a particular job. They're largely based in just sort of discrimination. When we took away the right of employers to discriminate based on race in the 1960s, when the Civil Rights Act was passed, our system gets creative and finds other ways to do it, by giving people a criminal record and keeping them from being able to access opportunity. And just one point, there's been some research about states that have more collateral consequences that make it more difficult for people to re-enter after they've had an interaction with the criminal legal system, actually have more crime. So the fewer barriers that we impose to people, the safer our community is. And the economic impact of this on our community and on the country is huge. One of the numbers it's about 7 years old, so it's probably a little greater now, is that we're losing about $87 billion in GDP each year from the unemployment and underemployment of people that have a criminal history. So, sorry, the text on this one is kind of small, and I'm happy to send around these slides to anybody that's interested. But like I said, employment is a great way to prevent recidivism. But in spite of that, we have all these barriers. One recent study from earlier this year showed that 64% of unemployed men have an arrest record and 46% of them have a conviction record. So if you care about unemployment, if you care about, issues with the labor market, then you have to care about this issue as well. And this is all in spite of the fact that there's really good research. The research is called desistance, this idea that most people who get into trouble at some point stop getting into trouble after a certain period of time. So there's good research that comes out of the Bureau of Justice Statistics that says that most recidivism, if people are going to get back in trouble again, it usually happens within 3 years of their arrest. If a person goes 3 years, they're very unlikely to get in trouble, and almost all of it happens within 5 years. And that's from arrest, not from like getting out of jail or finishing your sentence. It's from the time a person was arrested. So we're putting all these barriers on folks that can go 20, 30 years into their life or longer. One of the issues that we see a lot, and just popped up again for me last week, is barriers to senior housing for people that have had a felony conviction maybe 30, 35 years ago, which obviously has no bearing on who they are today and whether or not they can be a good resident of a senior housing facility. So just a little bit about, maybe I should stop there before I kind of get a little bit more specific about clearing records and see if there's any other questions. Yes.
Access to some of the studies you cited, are any of those by any chance available on the website, or do you want to do a little bit of our own further research?
To the statistics that I'm giving in the studies. I've also put some materials on the back table. There's one, it's kind of got 2 columns on it that talks about a law that we passed that went into effect January 2021 around expanding record clearing, because up until that point, you really couldn't get any convictions off of your record. It was only non-convictions. So we were finally able to get it. So some misdemeanor convictions and a few felony convictions could come off. So they're really small. You might have to get out your magnifying glass, but there are references to the studies that I'm talking about on that. And I'm happy to send something to anybody too. Yes, sir.
My understanding is that the record is not cleared, it's just not available to as many people. Is that right?
Yeah, so in Georgia, when we talk about record clearing, most people think of the word expungement. That's, I want to get my record expunged. We don't use the word expungement in Georgia. So there are several different paths to clearing your record in Georgia, several different laws that can come into play depending on what the charges that we're talking about and what the circumstances are. But the most common one, and the one that you'll see most at the event that we're having here in September, is called restriction and sealing. 2-step process. You have to do the 2 steps separately. So restriction is really the key word. What we're doing is we're restricting access to the record. We don't use the word expungement because it implies that the records are destroyed. Records are not destroyed in Georgia. They always remain available to law enforcement. But under restriction and sealing, we can restrict access to the record on the official criminal history maintained by the state, which can also be accessed by employers and housing providers. And then the second step of that is that we can actually seal the court record, and then it's no longer public record. So these private background check companies, which are the way most background checks are done, can't access it through the courthouses and shouldn't be showing it in a report. But yet you're right that the record always remains available to law enforcement, like to the district attorney or other prosecutors for purposes of if somebody gets in trouble again or something like that. Yes.
Hi. This is loud. I am curious about the record in regard, because there's a whole bunch of different things that could be on someone's record. How does, I don't know how to word this, but what kinds of records are is there some that are just not able to go through that, based on severity? How is it that, I don't know how to word this, but does that make sense to you? Yeah.
So, I've looked at thousands and thousands of records in my career at Georgia Justice Project, and they can vary very widely. Maybe somebody might come in that they were arrested once, the charge was dismissed, and that was it. Somebody might come in and they have a long history of struggling with addiction or mental health issues, and they've got 30 or 40 arrests on their record. Particularly folks that have extended periods of homelessness tend to pick up a lot of charges, shoplifting charges or trespassing, that kind of thing. So a record can vary incredibly widely. And you're right in terms of not everybody's going to be eligible under Georgia law to get their record cleared. So maybe I'll try to skip ahead a little bit and then come back to this and kind of tell you what the law is in Georgia, if I can. There we go. All right, so the big picture in Georgia, there are still many people who are left out of the opportunity to clear their record, to your question. What we can do, and I started with felony convictions on the top because those are our most serious crimes. That's the thing that can impose the most barriers to somebody. We have 3 different laws that allow us to potentially be able to restrict access to somebody's record. We have the Survivors First Act, which passed in 2020, which is for survivors of human and sex trafficking. And that is really the most powerful remedy that we have and impacts many more people than what you might think that it does. So it's always sometimes difficult to get our clients to talk about that because it can come from a very painful history in their life. But that's our most powerful remedy. It allows us to vacate a conviction on somebody's record. We then have something that we helped draft in 2016 called retroactive first offender. Has anybody ever heard of first offender before? It's like Georgia's second chance law. If you, let's say I have felony drug charges in Fulton County and I've never been in trouble before. I go in and my attorney says, can you please sentence, Brenda's never had any felony conviction before. This is an eligible charge because there's a bunch of charges that are not eligible. Can you sentence her as a first offender? Judge sentence says, okay, you get first offender. You successfully complete these 2 years of probation. And basically the record of your case will be limited and this will not be a conviction. So that's a very powerful remedy to keep somebody from having a conviction. A lot of people get it on the front end. Some people don't. So now we have a law where we can go back and get that. So that's very powerful because then they don't have a conviction. And then the most common one that I talked about already is restriction and sealing. So for felony convictions, this is a very limited remedy. The only people who have a felony conviction who can get their record sealed are people who have already received a pardon from the state of Georgia. In Georgia, and there's been a lot of talk about this in the news lately, but in Georgia, pardons are not granted by the governor. They are granted by the State Board of Pardons and Paroles, which is a committee appointed by the governor. Applying for a pardon, you're basically applying for a certificate of rehabilitation, a certificate of forgiveness from the state. It is an incredibly arduous process. There's a 12-page application. You have to, where have you lived for the last 10 years, every job that you've had, military records. Have you ever had any mental health issues? Did you receive treatment for that? Have you ever had addiction? Have you received treatment for that? Incredibly detailed application. It can take months to prepare. We have one of the ways people can volunteer, and some folks from Trinity have volunteered, is that we have a new pardon clinic to help people with that. So that's been a process in Georgia for decades, that you can get a pardon. What's new since 2020, since 2021, when we passed this new law, is that if you get a pardon, you can then ask the court to seal the record of that offense, unless it's a serious violent felony or a serious sex offense. So that's what we can do with pardons. With felony convictions, only about 450 people a year get a pardon. Most people who apply for it are denied. So most people can't do anything to actually seal a felony conviction in Georgia. We are trying to improve that. We are always trying to expand the law. So most people are stuck with the felonies on their record, and when they come in for a consultation, that's what we have to tell them, that you can apply for a pardon and walk them through that process. Misdemeanor convictions is where we had the big development in 2021. We have those same 2 remedies that I talk about, Survivors First Act and retroactive first offender. But our big expansion was that a person can now restrict and seal up to 2 misdemeanor conviction cycles on their record. And by cycles, I mean incidents. So sometimes I might have been arrested and I was charged with theft by shoplifting and trespassing at the same time, and I was convicted of them. That's one cycle. So then if I had another incident later where I had a misdemeanor, less than an ounce of marijuana conviction or something like that, I could potentially get both of those off of my record, sealed so that they wouldn't be available. So that's the vast majority of the convictions that we're able to deal with. First offender cases, sometimes there's still some paperwork that we have to deal with to help limit access to those. Pending charges, most pending charges can't come off of a person's record, if you're still waiting to go to court and see how your case was resolved. Because whether or not you can get your record cleared in Georgia depends on generally on how your case was resolved, what happened when you went to court. There's a very narrow category, not so narrow in Fulton County, but mostly narrow, where cases are put on hold. We call it a dead docket. And if they haven't been picked off that hold in over a year, then we can potentially get those sealed. And then non-conviction. So up until 2021, mostly what we were able to do for folks is if they came in and said, I was arrested for this, but I wasn't convicted, then we could get that sealed from their record so it wouldn't show up. Because oftentimes employers, housing providers will use things that even a person wasn't convicted of against them to deny them an opportunity. So we were very limited. Now we are slightly expanded, but there is still a long ways to go in terms of what people can get off of their record. So we do have to deliver a lot of bad news when we talk to people about their record. Did you have a question? We're mixing them in. Sorry.
I'm curious well, first of all, I applaud the work that you're doing. So it's amazing work, and I'm glad that Trinity can be little part of it in some way. Are there statistics on those whose records have been, what your word is, cleared, I guess?
Yeah.
For any other convictions? Is that a really big deterrent for these folks to ever commit additional crimes?
Yeah, absolutely, it is. So there was a study out of, I think it was Illinois, which has a much broader expungement law than what Georgia does. Many felony convictions can be sealed from a person's record. And what they found is if a person has received an expungement of a felony conviction, 5 years down the road, less than 1% of them had been convicted of something else. So if a person makes it to that point where they are eligible for expungement. And one thing I should have mentioned when I was talking before about the different ways that a person can clear their record is for felony convictions, you can't even apply for a pardon until you're 5 years off paper. So that means 5 years after you've completed your sentence. So if you had to go to prison and then you had parole or probation, you complete that. So that might be 10 years after you were convicted. Then you have to wait 5 more years until you can apply for a pardon. So it's a very long wait for folks that have a felony conviction. So if they haven't been in trouble then, if they got to the point where they're eligible for a pardon and they're granted a pardon, the likelihood of their getting in trouble again is very, very small. And on the misdemeanor side, again, to your question of, a lot of people we just have to say no to, those 2 misdemeanor convictions that you can get off your record, you can't apply for that until 4 years after your last conviction. So at that point, you're out of that sort of more risky period of 2 to 3 years where most recidivism happens. So there's very low recidivism for people that receive any sort of record clearing remedy. Well, I think we've managed to cover most of this in what we were talking about anyway, and so I'm just kind of backtracking a little bit. One thing to be aware of is that record clearing varies in every single state. Like I said, in Illinois, it's much broader than it is in Georgia. The process varies, the eligibility varies. In Georgia, we kind of come down a little bit in the middle. One thing, and this is not a policy conversation today. We always love to talk about policy, and we always love to get more people involved in policy. So I hope you'll pick up some of those materials in the back and follow us on our website. But we are constantly trying to expand what people can get off of their record to be more in line with some of the better states. And eventually we would like to move Georgia to where some states are going, which is called clean slate reform. I don't know if anybody has heard of that. But one of the things to be aware of about record clearing is in a state that has what's called a petition-based system, which means you got to go to court to clear your record. And that's the case in Georgia. So to get any record sealed, you got to file something with the court. You got to potentially have a hearing. So it's very difficult to do without an attorney, which is why it's great that we are able to do these events where we can kind of streamline the process. But in states where they've got this petition-based, you got to go to court system, Usually about 6% of eligible people are able to clear their record. In Georgia, and I know we're new, it was January 2021 where we expanded our law, but we are at 0.06% of eligible people under this new law have cleared their record. So we have an incredibly long ways to go, and there are simply never going to be enough resources to be able to help everybody clear their record. So what we want to do is move towards what other states are doing, which is some automatic expungement. That's called clean slate reform. So Pennsylvania was the first state to do it. So they said, after 10 years, most misdemeanors, they're just going to be expunged. You don't have to do anything. It just happens. So that's the only way we're ever going to really be able to help the majority of the people that have a record in Georgia. There are lots and lots of challenges to implementing something like that in Georgia. There's only one state that does any felonies, and that's California. It just passed last year. Most states, this is how they're dealing with a lot of the misdemeanors, the more minor offenses, which, like I mentioned, in Georgia, tend to be really minor offenses because we define most things as felonies. But there are a lot of technological problems, a lot of problems with how records are stored in Georgia. We've got 159 counties. Most of them have multiple courts. They don't communicate with one another. There's not a centralized court record system. So we've got a ways to go to get there, but that's something that we're working on. So this goes to your question, does record clearing work? Absolutely. There's been some studies that show that wages increase about 22% the first year after an expungement. And the study is kind of old, so I think it would actually be much higher now because wages have gone up for a lot of folks. But I think it was about 8 to 10 years ago, a study found an increase in income of about $6,000 just in the first year after a person received an expungement. And there we go to that study in Illinois that I mentioned. But I do want to mention that record clearing is only a partial solution. Like I said, we're never going to expunge our way totally out of this issue even if we had clean slate, we wouldn't be able to do that. So I think the more important thing is that we have conversations about this issue, about who gets a record, about how records are used against people in ways that don't, that aren't based in research, that aren't based in reality, that are based on fears. All of us show up in different spaces where we might be able, we have an impact on our organization, our company's hiring policies. Do you know how your organization considers criminal records? Every company can decide what they're going to consider, how far back they're going to go. So if you don't know what your company's, if you're working, find out what your company's policy is. A lot of companies have looked at this issue in recent years because of labor shortages, and they've gotten a little bit better. But particularly a lot of smaller companies maybe aren't there yet and maybe haven't looked at this issue in depth. Also, just look at your civic organizations that you're involved in. Can people volunteer if they have a criminal record? I know that I asked at my kids' school a number of years ago, because I had to get a background check to go on a field trip. And many parents are barred from going with their children on a field trip because of a record. When I asked the school about it, they had no idea who made the call or which records were okay and which records were not okay. So I think a lot of parents just wouldn't say, I want to go on a field trip because they were afraid of how that was going to be used against them. So I think it's important. The most important thing that we can do is sort of reevaluate our own assumptions about people with criminal records and of the different places that we show up, and how we might be able to sort of change the narrative around people with criminal records. Yes.
Several years ago, there was an effort to, I know it passed, ban the box on employment applications, so that there was, when somebody first applied for a job, they didn't have to reveal the fact that they had a criminal record. So that was taken off, and I think the person would have to reveal it at some point later in the application process. But I was wondering if you have any idea how that has affected employment for people who have records.
Yeah, so that was a big movement and is still a movement. In Georgia, former Governor Deal banned the box in state employment. So if you go to apply for a state job, they're not supposed to ask you on the front end about your record, unless there's like a statutory barrier, like you can't, have this job if you have this particular record. And then the city of Atlanta did the same thing, but there is no law in Georgia for private employers. So there are about 15 states around the country where ban the box applies to every single employer. And those employers have sorry, am I? Okay. Okay. Sorry. Well, I just wanted to finish and say that there's mixed results about whether or not ban the box is actually very effective. I mean, I think it was effective in getting employers to re-examine how they do things, and a lot of private employers that work in numerous states have, even in Georgia, are doing that. There are some studies that show it's actually made it somewhat worse for people with criminal records, because they will make assumptions about people, particularly if they're Black or Latino, and assume that they have a record if they're not seeing it up front. So the results are mixed. And I'm sorry that I went over. We're looking forward to the event. If anybody has any specific questions about the event and how that's going to work, I'm happy to stick around and answer them.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. And all of you, thank you for your good questions. It's always good when we go over on these kinds of things, but church does start in a few minutes. I want to say a couple of things. First, Brenda and the Georgia Justice Project is an incredibly accessible organization. So feel free to call and email and check in on the ways you can get involved. Some of those ways that Trinity members have gotten involved are working on the pardon reports and things of that nature. You don't have to be an attorney for that work, correct? You have to be someone who is a good writer and reader and communicator. I know all of you in this room, and y'all all hit the marks on that. So feel free to look into it. There's no age requirement, right? Maybe over 18?
Yeah.
Almost all of you hit that mark as well. So, sorry, James, maybe in a few years. The other couple of things I want to mention are just things here. The record restriction day is here on September 23rd. The involvement we need on that day is hosts. We need people to help greet people, show where the bathrooms are, show where the parking is. You are not involved in any of the actual legal work that's coming and happening on that day. We have volunteers from the DA's office and Georgia Justice Project doing that work. So this is an easy entry point to start becoming more proximate and to get more engaged and to view more of what's happening. And finally, the more recent thing that's coming is our Family Fun Day at the Metro Reentry Facility that we do with Northside United Methodist Church. Kristen Hunter spoke to that earlier. Sign up in the back, that's September 9th. So that's really soon. It's the Saturday right after Labor Day. And it's in the morning. The weather will be lovely, I'm certain. And again, if you can make a snow cone or use a cotton candy machine or follow instructions, we can use you on those days. I'm so sorry to end us. I'm going to close us with prayer and then move us all to worship. And then y'all can find Brenda either after worship or actually probably not after worship or online later. So let us pray. God, we thank you for these times to gather, times to learn from those who know more than us, times to learn about those things which we've always wondered, and times to ask good questions. Guide us as we leave this place. Take us into paths of more activism and teaching others. In your name we pray. Amen. See you all in worship.